Under the blazing sun of ancient Rome, where marble streets echo with the sound of chariot wheels and trumpets roar in the arena, another day begins. But behind the public baths, the crowded markets, and the lavish feasts lies a civilization of complexity, power, and human dreams. Today, you'll step into the daily life of a Roman citizen, from sunrise to starlight, through the temples, forums, and homes of the empire. Listen closely, feel deeply, and let yourself wander through the heart of an empire that once ruled the known world. A day in the life of a Roman citizen, a journey through the soul of the eternal city. In the soft quiet before sunrise, Rome lies blanketed in a gentle fog. The rooftops of terracotta tiles are still damp with the coolness of night. Somewhere, a rooster crows. The eternal city begins to stir. Inside a modest domus, a Roman home in the Subura district, a man awakens with the first light. His name is Gaius Marcellus, a middle-class Roman citizen, neither noble nor poor. His family has lived in this district for generations. The first sound in the house is the scraping of leather sandals on mosaic floor tiles. Then comes the creak of wooden shutters opening to let in the early light. A small oil lamp flickers beside the family altar. Lararium, where small figurines of household gods guard the home. Gaius rises, not with haste but with rhythm, a man used to structure, tradition, and the silent expectation of Roman duty. He washes his face with cold water from a bronze basin. In another room, his wife, Claudia, helps their daughter braid her hair. Their young son, Lucius, still sleeps, curled up in a blanket woven with his grandmother's hands. The house is alive but calm, wooden beams overhead, the faint scent of olive oil, and yesterday's bread lingering in the air. A slave named Felix, once a scholar in Greece, brings warm bread and honey for breakfast. Before eating, Gaius pauses at the lararium. He sprinkles a few grains of salt and flour, bows his head, and whispers a prayer to Lares and Penates, the spirits of home and hearth. This is Rome not as it is shown in marble triumphs, but as it lives in quiet mornings, in family rituals, in small moments passed from father to son. From the domus, one can hear distant sounds, vendors setting up stalls, the hooves of carts, the murmurs of another Roman morning. Today, Gaius will take his son to the thermae, the public baths. Later, they will visit the forum, where news of politics, philosophy, and rumor buzz like bees. But for now, there is only stillness, and in that stillness, Rome breathes. Not as an empire, but as a home. Mình có thể dịch sang tiếng Việt, hoặc bắt đầu ngay, the public baths. By mid-morning, the streets of Rome are alive. Dust rises from the stone-paved roads as sandals shuffle and cartwheels roll past fruit sellers and philosophers. Above it all, the sun climbs, casting golden light on temples and colonnades. This is the hour when the therma, the Roman public baths, come alive. Gaius walks hand in hand with his young son, Lucius, down the Via Agrippa. The boy's eyes widen with every step. Towering statues of gods, water flowing from lion-headed fountains, old men arguing politics under olive trees. Rome is a classroom for the curious. They arrive at Thermae of Agrippa, one of the oldest and grandest bathhouses in the city. The building itself is a marvel. White marble pillars, tiled mosaics shimmering in blues and greens, and the ever-present hum of water. Inside, the air is thick with heat and voices. Slaves move through the crowds, offering towels or carrying amphorae of oil. Senators bathe beside bakers. Children splash in the tepidarium, while old veterans massage stiff joints in the caldarium. To a Roman, the bathhouse is not just a place to cleanse the body. It is the heart of civic life. In the apoditerium, changing room, Gaius and Lucius undress. Their tunics are folded and stored by an attendant. Lucius giggles as Gaius rubs scented oil onto his arms, a mix of myrrh and olive. They begin in the tepidarium, the warm room. Light filters through high windows, illuminating steam rising from heated pools. Conversations drift like mist. Have you heard? The consul's wife is with child again. Grain prices rise. Blame Sicily. Next, they move to the caldarium, the hot room. Steam curls from every surface. Gaius breathes deeply, letting the warmth loosen his shoulders. Lucius splashes nearby, watched by an elderly man with cloudy eyes and a gentle smile. In the frigidarium, cold water shocks the skin into alertness. Lucius shrieks with laughter as he dives into the plunge pool. Gaius follows, gasping and grinning. Later, they recline in the outer gardens, drying under the sun, drinking sweet wine from small cups. "Why do we do this every week, Father?" Lucius asks. Gaius smiles. "Because Rome is not just built with stones," he says. "It is built with people, and this is where people breathe together." Around them, the baths echo with voices of the city, rich and poor, old and young, friends, rivals, sharing heat, water, and stories. It is not just a bath. It is a ritual, a communion. And when they leave, their skins glow, not just from heat, but from the soul of Rome itself. As midday bells echo from temple towers, Gaius and his son, Lucius, leave the Thermae with clean skin and light spirits. Their next destination is the beating heart of Roman life, the Forum Romanum. Nestled between the Capitoline and Palatine hills, the Forum is more than just an open square. It is the very soul of the Republic, a theater where politics, philosophy, and commerce perform side by side. The marble streets gleam beneath the high sun. Stalls overflow with scrolls, figs, silk from the east, and olives from the countryside. Priests chant beside merchants, orators shout over philosophers. The air itself is thick with debate, ambition, and the scent of rosemary bread. Gaius pauses with Lucius before the rostra, the elevated platform where Rome's speakers deliver their arguments to the crowd. Today, a man in a tattered toga stands there, not a senator but a philosopher. "You speak of conquest," he declares, arms raised. "But can we conquer ourselves?" People gather, some nod, some jeer. Lucius looks up at his father. "Is he important?" Gaius chuckles. "In Rome, anyone with words can be important." Nearby, in front of the Basilica Julia, a group of patricians argue law and taxes, their hands slicing through the air as if every gesture rewrote the law. Elsewhere, a group of young students huddle around an old man in a faded Greek robe, likely a Stoic teacher. Lucius tugs his father's arm. "What are they talking about?" Gaius listens a moment. "Whether happiness comes from reason or from fate," he replies, "and whether a man can be free if he serves virtue." Lucius frowns, confused. "And what do you think, Father?" Gaius kneels and meets his son's eyes. "I think freedom is in the choices we make, even if we make them while wearing chains." They continue walking past temples dedicated to Saturn, Vesta, and Mars. The scent of burning incense lingers. Senators glide by in white togas with crimson borders. Vendors shout about new arrivals of Egyptian wine and Syrian spices. Suddenly, a procession passes. Trumpets blare. Soldiers in polished breastplates march through the forum, flanked by cheering citizens. A general returns from campaign. But Gaius does not cheer. He leans down to Lucius and says softly, "Many cheer power. Few understand its burden." As they sit beneath a statue of Romulus, founder of the city, Gaius takes a moment of silence. "This is Rome, Lucius, not just stone and blood, but ideas, arguments, and the noise of freedom." The forum quiets as the sun begins to dip. The crowd thins, but echoes of voices, ancient, passionate, and wise, linger in the marble colonnades. In every whispered debate and shouted protest, the city breathes, and Lucius listens. The Arenad, honor, and as the sun drifts toward its golden arc, the air grows electric in the city of Rome. From narrow alleys and bustling squares, thousands of feet begin to converge on a single destination, the Colosseum, or as the Romans call it, the Flavian Amphitheater. Gaius and Lucius join the steady stream of citizens. Rich and poor alike climb the wide steps, each assigned to their own tier. Senators near the front, merchants in the middle, slaves and foreigners high above. Even status has its place in blood. The crowd murmurs like a sea before a storm. Horns sound, drums beat, a voice echoes from the podium. "Let the games begin." The gates of the arena creak open. First come the Venetianas, animal hunts. Lions imported from Africa, leopards from Asia, even crocodiles from the Nile. Beastmasters step forward, armed with nets, spears, and courage. The crowd gasps as a lion charges. A man falls. The sand turns red. Lucius grips his father's tunic. "Is this right?" Gaius places a hand on his son's shoulder. "It's Rome, my son, and Rome hungers for spectacle. But the true spectacle is still to come. After the beasts, the gladiators enter. Men trained to fight. Some are slaves, some criminals. A few are volunteers seeking fame. All are warriors bound by honor and the edge of a blade. The announcer calls their names. The crowd cheers. Then, silence. Two men step into the center of the arena. One is a retiarius, net and trident in hand, light and fast. the other a secutor, armed with sword and shield, his helmet glinting under the sun. They circle, fight, clite, metal against metal, sand kicked into the air, cheers, cries, a dance of death. Lucius cannot look away, and then the retiarius falls. The secutor stands over him. A decision must be made. All eyes turn to the Emperor's box. Thumb raised? Mercy. Thumb down? Death. A pause. The Emperor lifts his hand, then lowers his thumb. A cry from the crowd. The final blow is struck. The retiarius lies still. Lucius whispers, "He fought so well, why must he die?" Gaius replies, "Because Rome rewards strength and punishes weakness, even in death." But there are other moments too. A woman in the crowd offers a gladiator a crown of flowers. A defeated man spares his opponent. And sometimes the Emperor grants libertas, freedom for valor. As the crowd disperses, Gaius and Lucius step out into the cooling air. The boy walks in silence, the roar of the arena still ringing in his ears. "Father," he says at last, "is honor real or just another game?" Gaius looks up at the Colosseum, then at his son. "Both," he says quietly, "but only those who bleed for it know the difference." The sky dims into dusk, shadows stretch across the ancient stones, and the sand of the arena, now crimson, sleeps once again beneath the weight of glory and silence. Dinner at the Domus and Philosophy. As the sky turns from gold to indigo, a softer rhythm returns to Rome. The streets grow quieter, lamps are lit, and across the city, the scent of roasted herbs and warm bread begins to drift from open windows. Gaius and Lucius return home, a domus nestled behind a small courtyard of olive trees and painted frescoes. It is not a palace, but it is warm, familiar. In the atrium, Gaius's wife Livia greets them. She has prepared the cena, the evening meal. The slaves, quiet and efficient, serve with practiced grace. One pours wine, another brings figs and cheese. A young girl carefully lights the bronze oil lamps. They recline around the triclinium, the dining couches, just as Roman custom dictates. The meal begins simply: olives, honeyed dates, and flatbread. Then come bowls of lentil stew, roasted chicken with garum sauce, and spiced wine in terracotta cups. Lucius eats with a boy's hunger, but Gaius, as always, eats with thought. "You must taste," he says to his son, "not devour. A meal is a time for reflection." Between courses, the family speaks not of battle or politics, but of the day, of dreams, of stories. Tonight, Gaius shares a tale from Cicero, how words could defeat swords, and how justice, when spoken truly, was Rome's greatest weapon. Livia smiles, wiping her hands with lavender-scented cloth. "And yet we still send our sons to war, not school," she says gently. Gaius nods, "because Rome is built on both." Lucius listens closely, not just to the words, but to the rhythm of family, of tradition, of a world both orderly and strange. As dessert is served, pears soaked in honey and cinnamon, an old friend visits. Marcus, a Stoic philosopher and tutor, joins them. He brings with him a scroll and a question. Is virtue taught or born? The family debates. Lucius says born. Gaius argues for teaching. Livia, as always, finds the middle path. The candles flicker. The night deepens. Outside, the world is uncertain. Emperors rise and fall, borders shift, and storms brew on distant horizons. But here in this room, beneath painted ceilings and carved columns, time slows. After the meal, Gaius pours a final cup of wine. He raises it gently. To Rome, not just of marble and conquest, but of homes, of ideas, and of those we share them with. They drink. And somewhere in the city, far from the games and the Senate halls, a Roman boy full of food and questions leans into his father's words. Because in the domus, it is not just bodies that are nourished, but minds, hearts, and legacies. The night winds whisper through the olive trees, and Rome, ancient and eternal, breathes through the quiet joy of family. So of politics, philosophy, and public life. As dawn rises on a new day in Rome, the heartbeat of the city awakens not in palaces or barracks, but in the Forum. The Forum Romanum, once a marshy valley, is now the grand stage of public life, where voices echo off marble columns and citizens shape the soul of the Republic and the Empire. Gaius, dressed in his formal toga, walks hand in hand with Lucius beneath the statues of heroes. The boy's eyes widen at the sheer scale. Temples, arches, basilicas, and colonnades bustle with debates, commerce, and ceremony. Here, politics is not confined to halls. It is a theater of words, where speakers stand upon the rostra, raising their voices above the clamor of carts and footsteps. A senator speaks of grain shortages. A merchant argues for trade reform. A philosopher quotes Plato, and somewhere a man simply reads poetry aloud, because here even beauty has its place in civic life. This is Rome's true heart, Gaius whispers to Lucius, where ideas compete like gladiators and laws are forged not with blades, but with reason. The boy watches as two men clash in debate. No swords are drawn, yet the tension crackles in the air. Behind them, scribes jot down speeches. Orators rehearse. Women in stolas whisper news to each other. Foreign envoys watch curiously, trying to understand this dance of dignity and pride. Philosophy flows freely here, like water through aqueducts. Stoics speak of virtue, Epicureans of pleasure, and cynics of freedom from desire. Gaius pauses beside an old man with a white beard, Marcus, the Stoic tutor from last night. What makes a man great? Lucius dares to ask. Marcus replies, not power nor wealth, but to speak truly, to serve justly, to endure silently. They pass a shrine where a soldier prays before the goddess Fortuna. At another corner, two men petition a magistrate for justice in a property dispute. The forum is a paradox, sacred and profane, loud and thoughtful, eternal and yet always changing. And it belongs to everyone, to the wealthy patrician in purple-trimmed robes, to the freedman shouting about taxes, to the child absorbing wisdom like sunlight. Before leaving, Gaius stops and turns to Lucius. One day you will speak here. But remember, a true Roman does not speak to win. He speaks to serve. Lucius nods, the words engraving themselves on his heart. As they step away from the forum, the marble behind them catches the morning sun, shimmering like the ideals it holds. The voices fade, but their echoes linger in the minds of all who pass through. Because in Rome, public life is not a burden, it is a calling. Gods among men, temples, rituals, and belief. As the midday sun warms the rooftops of Rome, the clang of bronze bells and the scent of burning incense mark the passage into the divine. Religion in Rome is not confined to the temples. It flows through the streets, the homes, the senate halls. It is woven into the very breath of the city. Gaius and Lucius climb the Capitoline Hill, where the great temple of Jupiter, Optimus Maximus, stands like a crown above the city. Its columns rise proudly toward the heavens, and its steps echo with centuries of devotion. Inside, offerings lie at the feet of Jupiter's statue: coins, figs, oil, the quiet prayers of men and women who ask not for power, but for stability, for peace, for the safe return of a son from war. The gods, Gaius says to Lucius, do not demand perfection, only reverence, only gratitude. They move from temple to temple, the round temple of Vesta with its sacred flame tended only by virgin priestesses, the temple of Mars, red with banners and sword-shaped incense, the hidden shrines of Janus, the god of doorways and beginnings. But religion here is more than grand ritual. In the streets, common folk light candles at crossroads, whispering to household gods. The lares and penates, guardians of family and home. Clay figurines sit in quiet corners of kitchens. Sacred chickens are fed to divine the future. Lightning strikes are read as omens. Even emperors fear the gods. In the forum, a general preparing for battle walks barefoot to the altar of Bellona, goddess of war. Nearby, a mother blesses her child with water from a holy fountain. Rome is not great because she is mighty, says Gaius. She is great because she believes. Believes in something larger than herself. In destiny, in justice, in the invisible hand that guides the fate of emperors and farmers alike. They reach a small hilltop where an augur reads the flight of birds, his arms outstretched like wings. Below him, the rooftops of Rome shimmer in the sun. Temples. Homes. The mighty Colosseum. Lucius looks upward, not at the sky, but beyond it. Will the gods always protect us? He asks. Gaius smiles gently. Only if we remember to protect each other. They light a small lamp beneath a cypress tree. No grand temple, no priest, just a flame, a whisper, and a hope. Because in Rome, belief is not always shouted. Sometimes it is a quiet promise, shared between generations, passed from father to son. And in that promise, the gods are not above men, but among them. In flames, a Roman dinner in a patrician villa. As the sun begins to dip behind the 7 hills of Rome, shadows stretch across marble courtyards. The sounds of the city soften, replaced by music, harps, flutes, the soft trill of lyres drifting from private gardens. For Rome's elite, the evening is not a time of rest, but of display, indulgence, and politics woven into pleasure. Gaius receives an invitation from Senator Claudius, an old friend with powerful allies. Tonight's cena, dinner, will be no simple meal, but a carefully staged ritual of status and refinement. Lucius is awed as they enter the grand villa in the Esquiline district. Slaves in white tunics greet them with perfumed water for washing. A peacock struts along a mosaic-tiled hallway, its feathers shimmering under the glow of oil lamps. The triclinium, the dining room, is breathtaking. 3 reclining couches form a U shape around a low, polished table. Bronze statues guard the corners, and frescoes of Bacchus and Venus dance along the walls. The air is sweet with roasted herbs, incense, and wine. The feast begins. Course after course arrives. Stuffed dormice glazed with honey and poppy seeds, spiced lentils and garum-seasoned fish, flamingo tongue, a delicacy for the bold, fresh oysters brought from the Bay of Naples, and finally roasted boar, presented whole, with dates and pomegranate seeds glistening on its back. But the real center of the room isn't the food. It's conversation. Senator Claudius raises his cup and speaks of border tensions in Germania. Another guest quotes Cicero between bites of eel. Gaius listens, careful to nod at the right moments, to offer witty, safe opinions. Not too bold, not too silent. A Roman dinner, he once told Lucius, is like a battlefield. Only the weapons are wine, wit, and wealth. Slaves refill goblets of Falernian wine, strong, fragrant, and expensive. Laughter ripples like silk. A poet stands to recite verses written that afternoon. A dancer twirls, silver bangles clinking in rhythm. And yet, amid the indulgence, there are whispers. Politics. Rumors of a new tax. A general gaining too much popularity. A cousin exiled for his beliefs. Power always hovers, even where there is pleasure. Lucius asks softly, "Is this what Rome truly is?" Gaius replies, "It is one face of her, but every coin has 2 sides." As the night deepens, torches flicker and faces flush. The last course, honeyed dates and chilled mulsum, is served. Outside, the city hums low under moonlight. In the silence that follows the final toast, Lucius watches the glowing embers in the brazier. He doesn't just see luxury, he sees the cost of it. The labor, the masks worn, the weight of keeping one's place at the table. Rome, he realizes, is not just a city, it's a stage. And tonight, he's seen one of its grandest performances. The morning after the patrician feast breaks gently over Rome, and with it comes a different kind of thrill. The roar of thousands, the clash of steel, and the drama of life and death played out under the open sky. Today, Gaius and Lucius join the massive crowd flowing through the marble arches of the Colosseum, the Flavian Amphitheater, the greatest arena in the Roman world. It is public spectacle, state-funded entertainment, and imperial propaganda all at once. The arrival. Vendors shout through the streets. Roasted chickpeas, fresh figs, wine by the cup, children ride on fathers' shoulders, noble women in silk clutch perfumed cloths to their noses, and ex-soldiers with missing limbs take their seats with the pride of survivors. Gaius, being of equestrian rank, sits in the upper reserved section. Lucius watches wide-eyed as they pass stone seating tiers sorted by status. Senators, knights, plebeians, freedmen, and finally slaves, standing. This hierarchy isn't just in politics, it's etched into stone. The arena floor gleams with sand soaked in the blood of yesterday. Beneath it, in dark holding cells, gladiators wait, praying or cursing. The games begin, trumpets blare, a magistrate in a purple-bordered toga rises. The editor, the sponsor of the games, makes a short speech, then drums. The wooden gate groans open, and 2 retiari stride into view. Net and trident in hand, they dance and taunt. The crowd yells, bets are made, names are chanted, steel clashes. One retiarius tangles his opponent in netting, but the man cuts free, only to slip and fall. "Missus! Ugula!" The crowd is torn. "Spare him, kill him." Gaius leans forward. The editor signals with his hand. Mercy. The defeated man breathes again. Lucius is stunned. They cheer for blood. Gaius responds softly. They cheer for drama, for justice, for Rome. Wild beasts and tragedy. Midday. Cages roll in. The Venetians begin. Beast hunts. Lions from Africa, bears from Gaul, leopards from Syria. Some charge out with fury. Others, half-starved, only limp. A hunter is mauled. The crowd gasps. Another beast leaps but is skewered midair. Applause. Lucius turns his face. Gaius lays a hand on his shoulder. This is not only about strength. It is also about fate. Later, condemned criminals are marched out. Some to be burned, others dressed as mythological figures and slain in theatrical fashion. Entertainment wrapped in execution. Hush. Glory and shadows. The finale brings the Myrmilones, heavily armored, tall and slow, versus Thraces, agile with curved swords. The battles are spectacular. Swordplay, trickery, raw courage. One gladiator drops his opponent, raises his sword. All eyes turn to the imperial box, though no emperor sits there today. The sponsor decides. The crowd holds its breath. Thumbs turn sideways. Blood darkens the sand once again. Reflection. As the sun dips low and the arena empties, Lucius walks beside Gaius in silence. "Is this Rome's heart?" he finally asks. "No," Gaius says, "it is her mask." "Then what is her heart?" Gaius answers, "Come with me tomorrow, to the temple, to the forum, to the words we carve in marble, not the cries we spill in blood." And so, under the looming arches of the Colosseum, they leave, two citizens walking through shadow and sunlight, between power and memory, in a city forever torn between glory and cost. Temples and eternity, faith and the Roman soul, Tronglat Trient, a day in the life of a Roman citizen. Part X, Temples and Eternity, Faith and the Roman Soul. As the last golden light of day filters over the marble rooftops of Rome, Gaius leads Lucius through the Forum Romanum, where shadows stretch long across columns and statues. Here, among the remnants of history and the whispers of gods, the heart of Rome still beats. The pantheon of belief. Though Romans worship a multitude of gods, Jupiter, Mars, Venus, Minerva, they also believe deeply in virtues. Pietas, duty; fides, loyalty; gravitas, dignity. Lucius follows Gaius through the Temple of Vesta, where eternal flames burn under the care of virgin priestesses. One misstep could mean disgrace. One breath near the sacred flame feels like touching time itself. Then they stop before the Temple of Jupiter Optimus Maximus, the king of gods. Gaius offers a small coin at the altar and bows his head. "Why do you still pray?" Lucius asks. "To remind myself," Gaius answers, "that power is not divine, but responsibility is." Between gods and emperors, Rome's religion is not only spiritual, it is political. The emperor is Pontifex Maximus, chief priest. To serve the gods is to serve the state. Public festivals, triumphal marches, sacrifices, they are civic rituals as much as sacred ones. In their walk, they pass shrines tucked between buildings, where commoners light candles for household spirits, Laris and Penas, hoping for health, for safety, for love. Every layer of society is tied to the gods, from slaves to senators. Even those who question, like philosophers or early Christians, do so quietly, carefully. For the Roman soul is shaped by order, by ritual, and by the fear of divine imbalance. Reflections under the stars. Later, they sit on a quiet stone bench overlooking the Tiber. Above them, stars emerge like silver tears in the sky. What will become of us? Lucius wonders. We will fade, Gaius says, as all things do, but Rome may live in marble and memory. He pauses, then adds, the bathhouse, the Senate, the arena, the temple, they are all faces of the same city, but it is the people, with their hopes and doubts, their toil and laughter, who give it breath. Lucius closes his eyes. The voices of the forum fade. The scent of incense, of dust and rain fills the air, and for one brief moment, the soul of Rome is quiet and eternal. End of series, A Day in the Life of a Roman Citizen. And as night falls over the Tiber, the cheers from the arena fade, and the temple flames flicker low. Our day in Rome comes to a close, not just of gods or emperors, but of people who loved, hoped, and believed in something greater than themselves. Empires may fall, but memory and story endures. Thank you for walking with us through time. Until the next tale from history, farewell. In the blazing age of feudal Europe, two legendary tales emerged, one about unshakable loyalty, the other a tragic saga of power and betrayal. The first is the story of William Marshal, a knight not born into greatness, yet he became the guardian of 5 English kings, living with honor and dying with glory. His life is a ballad of loyalty, wisdom, and unmatched courage. Next, we descend into the Wars of the Roses, where the houses of Lancaster and York waged a brutal civil war for over 30 years. Filled with political marriages, betrayal, and bloodshed, it all ended with the rise of a new dynasty, the Tudors, built on the bones of the fallen. In this special combined episode, we explore 2 faces of medieval England. one who fought for ideals and others who perished for the crown. The Wars of the Roses. Part 1. Whispers Before the Storm. In the fading embers of the mid-4th century, England was a kingdom in quiet decay. Once glorious under King Edward III, the realm now stumbled forward, weary from war and plagued by weak leadership. The 100 Years' War had drained coffers and blood alike. The people hungered, not just for bread, but for stability, for clarity, for leadership. But the throne of England had never been more uncertain. The king was Henry VI, crowned as a boy, barely 1 year old, after his father, Henry V, the great warrior king, died suddenly. The boy king grew up shy, soft-spoken, and deeply religious. He loved books, prayer, and quiet. But the court, the nobles, and the country needed more than prayer. They needed a ruler who could hold power, and he was not that. Behind the velvet curtains of Westminster, two powerful families, both of royal Plantagenet blood, began to scheme. The House of Lancaster, descendants of John of Gaunt, held the crown through Henry VI. The House of York, descended from Edmund of Langley, quietly believed their claim was stronger, their blood more legitimate. And in this brewing storm stood two men, Richard, Duke of York, a bold and intelligent noble with military skill and popular support. Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, cousin to the king and favored by Queen Margaret. Queen Margaret of Anjou, the French-born wife of Henry VI, began to fear the Yorkists' influence. She saw them not as nobles, but as traitors in waiting. And so, in the silent corridors of power, resentment grew. Alliances were made in secret. Soldiers trained behind castle walls. Whispered prayers became whispered plots. England did not yet know it, but a civil war was coming. A war of roses. A war of kin against kin. And it would reshape the throne forever. Part 2, The Madness of the King. When the Crown Trembles. The year was 1453. While distant thunder rolled across the fields of France, in Westminster Palace, a darker storm began to take shape, not of sword or siege, but of silence and shadow. King Henry VI, now a grown man in his early 30s, began to lose touch with the world around him. One autumn morning, he simply stopped speaking. He stared at the walls for days, then weeks. He did not recognize his courtiers. He didn't acknowledge the birth of his own son, Edward of Westminster. He was awake, but absent. A living ghost on the throne. The court panicked. Who would rule in his place? The kingdom could not afford a king with no mind. Enter Richard, Duke of York. Popular among the nobles and respected by Parliament, Richard was appointed Lord Protector of the realm. Suddenly, the Yorkist cause was no longer a whisper. It was power itself. But behind the royal cradle, Queen Margaret of Anjou stirred. Fierce, proud, and protective, Margaret feared Richard's growing influence. To her, he was not a savior, but a threat, a usurper waiting for the crown to fall. She rallied her allies, the Beauforts, the Percys, and powerful Lancastrians loyal not to the king, but to her. York, meanwhile, governed wisely. The treasury stabilized. Law and order returned. For a brief moment, England tasted peace, but it would not last. In 1454, Henry VI suddenly recovered. He spoke again, he smiled at his son, and with that, Richard of York was stripped of power. The Queen regained control. The Beauforts returned to court, and the seeds of civil war, once planted, now broke through the surface. Richard knew there could no longer be two powers in England. It was either the House of Lancaster or the House of York. And so the stage was set, not for politics, not for diplomacy, but for blood. Part 3, the first battle, St. Albans, 1455, where blood touched the crown. It was May 1455. The spring air carried the scent of blossoms, but also the tension of war. In the town of St. Albans, north of London, two armies stood facing one another across narrow streets and timbered houses. On one side, Richard, Duke of York, and his allies, the Nevilles, most notably Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, a young but ambitious man who would later earn the title, the Kingmaker. On the other side, the Lancastrian forces, led by Edmund Beaufort, Duke of Somerset, and loyal to the now recovered King Henry VI, who was present but still frail and uncertain. The town's gates were closed. The Lancastrians had taken defensive positions. But York sent a message: "We seek only the removal of evil advisers. Let the king come forth unharmed." There was no reply. And so, On the morning of May 22nd, the Battle of St. Albans began. The Yorkists attacked from the gardens behind the houses, bursting through side streets and overwhelming the defenders. Swords clashed on cobblestone, blood-stained churchyards. In the chaos, the Duke of Somerset, the Queen's closest ally, was killed. His body lay near the market cross, cut down with ruthless precision. Other Lancastrian leaders followed. Henry VI was found hiding in a tanner's shop, dazed and confused. York approached with care, knelt and assured the king he meant no harm. But the message was clear. If the king cannot rule, then others must. The first true civil battle of the Wars of the Roses had ended in a Yorkist victory. Yet it was not victory that echoed. It was the shattering of trust. For the first time in a century, blood had been drawn in the name of English succession. The Queen, Margaret of Anjou, was not present. But when she heard the news, her heart burned with fury. She would not forgive York. She would not forget St. Albans. And she would never allow her son's inheritance to be taken. The war was no longer political. It was now personal. Part 4, The Queen Strikes Back. Margaret of Anjou and the Rise of the Lancastrian Cause. The bloodshed at St. Albans in 1455 had changed everything. Though King Henry VI was rescued by the Yorkists, his weakness was now undeniable. It was his queen, Margaret of Anjou, who rose to fill the void. She was no ordinary consort. Fiercely intelligent, politically savvy, and utterly devoted to securing the future for her only son, Edward of Westminster, Margaret was determined to crush the Yorkist threat. "They struck the king," she whispered to her closest allies. "They spilled royal blood. They must answer for treason." Henry, once again descending into mental instability, became a passive figurehead. Parliament named Richard, Duke of York, as Lord Protector, ruling in Henry's stead. But Margaret refused to accept it. In private, she forged alliances, calling on loyal Lancastrians, Welsh lords, and Scottish nobles. In public, she rallied support for the true heir, her son. All across England, people began choosing sides, not only based on loyalty to the king, but allegiance to Margaret or to York. Families were split. Noble houses were torn. By 1459, the Queen's efforts bore fruit. She summoned her loyalists to arms. At Ludford Bridge, York's army was demoralized and scattered. Margaret declared the Yorkists traitors. Their estates were seized. Their allies were hunted. But the Yorkists would not vanish so easily. Richard of York fled to Ireland. Warwick and Edward, York's son, escaped to Calais. There they regrouped. There they planned. Meanwhile, Margaret had Henry in her possession, but she could not rule alone. She knew what she had to do: win on the battlefield and kill York before he could return. What had begun as a political conflict had now evolved into a full-blown civil war, led on one side by a fierce queen defending her child's crown, and on the other by a displaced duke who believed he was the rightful king. The next battles would decide not only the fate of England, but of dynasties. And Margaret, once dismissed as a foreign-born bride, had become the beating heart of the Lancastrian cause. The Wars of the Roses. Part 5, The Yorkist Return and the Claim to the Throne. The Fall of Richard of York and the Rise of his Son. Winter of 1460. The wind off the English Channel was sharp and unforgiving, but it carried a whisper of war. From Calais, 3 figures prepared to strike back: Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, known now as the Kingmaker; Edward of March, the eldest son of York; and Richard, Duke of York himself. England would soon tremble again. They landed in Kent with swift precision, rallying discontented nobles and citizens. Margaret's government had grown harsh. Her seizure of Yorkist lands, her hunt for traitors, her foreign support from Scotland and France left many uneasy. When Warwick and Edward reached London, they were welcomed as liberators. The city opened its gates. Parliament wavered. Even among the Lancastrians, doubts began to grow. York marched into Westminster, and for the first time, laid his hand on the throne. "I am the rightful heir," he proclaimed boldly in front of the Lords. "My claim is stronger than Henry's. The crown should be mine." A chill settled over the chamber, but York had overreached. The peers, shocked by the audacity, hesitated. Henry VI, though weak, was still king by law and anointed by God. The compromise? The Act of Accord. Henry would remain king, but York would succeed him, disinheriting Prince Edward, Margaret's son. It was unthinkable to the Queen. Enraged, Margaret of Anjou gathered a Lancastrian army in the north. She would not allow her son's birthright to be erased by parchment. Then came Wakefield, December 1460. York marched north to meet her, unaware of the full scale of her forces. It was a trap. On a snowy battlefield near Sandal Castle, York fell. His son, Edmund, was captured and executed. The Duke's head was spiked on Micklegate Bar in York, mockingly crowned with a paper crown. But death did not end the Yorkist claim. From the ashes of his father's ambition, Edward of March now rose with vengeance in his blood. He was tall, charismatic, and just 19 years old, but his sword would soon speak louder than any document. The tides of war had turned again. England had lost a duke, but gained a warrior king in waiting. And Margaret's temporary victory had come at a high price. She had awakened a rival far more dangerous than Richard of York. The storm was not over. It was just beginning. The Wars of the Roses, Part 6, The Rise of Edward Fort and the Shifting Tides of Power, From Blood to Crown, Spring 1461. England, still trembling from the brutal death of Richard of York, now looked to his son. Edward of March, barely 19, rode south from the Welsh borders. His eyes were not filled with grief, but with fire. In his heart burned the memory of his father's severed head and the promise of vengeance, and he would not wait long. At Mortimer's Cross, Edward faced a Lancastrian army in February 1461. On the morning of battle, 3 suns appeared in the sky, a rare meteorological phenomenon. His men fell to their knees in awe. Edward stood and proclaimed, "These are the 3 sons of York, shining upon us, a sign of God's favor." It was a powerful omen. The Yorkists won a decisive victory. Meanwhile, Queen Margaret and her army were marching south, looting towns and spreading terror. Their brutal path inflamed popular fear. Edward, now joined by Warwick, entered London to cheers. Henry VI had fled. Parliament wavered no more. On March 4, 1461, Edward of York was proclaimed King Edward IV, the first true Yorkist monarch. But his crown was not yet secure. 10 days later came Towton, the bloodiest battle ever fought on English soil. In a blizzard of snow and steel, tens of thousands clashed. Warwick bled from a head wound. Margaret's forces screamed their defiance, arrows blackened the sky, men slipped in rivers of blood. At the end of the day, the River Cock ran red with the dead. Over 28,000 men lay slain. But Edward stood victorious. Henry and Margaret fled to Scotland. Their son, Prince Edward, just a boy, was carried with them. Edward IV entered York and took down his father's severed head. He buried him honorably. The House of York had not only avenged its fallen, it had seized the throne by right of conquest. Edward IV, tall, golden-haired, and fearless, ruled from London. But already seeds of new conflict were being sown. Warwick, his greatest supporter, was growing restless. The kingmaker was not content with shadows. He had helped place a king on the throne. The Wars of the Roses, Part 7, The Kingmaker Turns, When Loyalty Becomes a Weapon. By 1464, Edward IV had solidified his grip on the English throne. His early rule was strong, his court admired, his people hopeful. But behind the golden image of peace, a storm brewed. And it began with a marriage. Edward, handsome, headstrong, and defiant, secretly wed Elizabeth Woodville, a Lancastrian widow of noble birth. She was beautiful, but not royal, and her family was seen as opportunists. When news of the marriage broke, Richard Neville, the Earl of Warwick, the man they called the Kingmaker, was furious. "I raised him up," Warwick muttered in cold halls, "and now he turns his back." He had been negotiating a marriage between Edward and a French princess, one that would secure powerful alliances. Edward's impulsive marriage ruined years of diplomacy and humiliated Warwick before Europe's courts. Tensions only deepened. Edward showered the Woodville family with titles and lands. Elizabeth's many siblings married into England's greatest houses, further enraging the old nobility. Warwick, once the master of kings, now found himself sidelined. His voice in council was softer. His influence waned. In the shadows, Warwick began to plot. He turned to Edward's own brother, George, Duke of Clarence. Ambitious and insecure, George felt overlooked. Warwick whispered poison in his ear. "The crown should be yours, not your reckless brother's." In Fort 69, rebellions broke out across the north. Warwick's hand was hidden, but all suspected his involvement. Edward crushed the uprisings, but when he confronted Warwick, the rift could no longer be healed. Then, in a bold and shocking move, Warwick and Clarence fled to France. There, in the court of King Louis XII, sworn enemies became allies. Warwick, the Yorkist power behind the throne. Margaret of Anjou, the fiery Lancastrian queen. Together they struck an impossible bargain. Warwick would restore Henry VI, the gentle broken king, to the throne. In return, his daughter would marry Prince Edward, the Lancastrian heir. It was a stunning reversal. The kingmaker who had dethroned Henry VI now vowed to put him back on the throne. And England, once again, braced for war. The Wars of the Roses. Part 8, The Redemption of Henry VI. When the crown falls twice. In 1470, like a ghost rising from the grave, Henry VI returned to the throne of England. But it was not by strength nor by will. It was Warwick, the once Yorkist kingmaker, who placed the feeble king back upon the throne he had lost nearly a decade before. And Henry? He was frail, broken, more monk than monarch. He sat in silence on the throne, speaking little, his crown heavy, his eyes distant. Behind the velvet curtains, Warwick ruled. He controlled the court, made the decisions, and promised a Lancastrian future. But England knew. This peace was thin as parchment. Edward IV had not disappeared. He had fled to the Burgundian court, where his sister, Duchess Margaret, and her husband, Charles the Bold, received him. Though reluctant at first, Burgundy soon backed Edward with gold and ships, fearing French influence should Warwick succeed. By early 1471, Edward returned, his brother Richard, Duke of Gloucester, by his side. With a small but elite force, he landed in Yorkshire. The North, long loyal to the House of York, rose to greet him. Warwick scrambled. He had misjudged Edward's resolve. The nobles who once feared the Woodvilles began to question their allegiance to Warwick. As Edward marched south, his brother George, Duke of Clarence, who had once betrayed him, switched sides again, rejoining Edward with thousands of men. Edward, ever shrewd, forgave him. "We are brothers," he said. "Let blood not divide us again." Then came the turning point. On April 14, 1471, at the Battle of Barnet, Edward's forces clashed with Warwick's under the foggy dawn sky. The fog misled Warwick's own men, causing friendly fire and chaos. Warwick, betrayed by weather and war, was defeated. He tried to flee but was cut down and killed, his body stripped, his power gone. The kingmaker was no more. Just days later, Queen Margaret of Anjou, who had returned from exile with her son, arrived, too late to aid Warwick. Still she pressed forward, hoping to rally the Lancastrian cause. But Edward, swift and merciless, met her again at Tewkesbury. And there, in a final blow to the Lancastrian line, Prince Edward, Margaret's only son, was slain in battle. Captured, broken, and widowed in purpose, Margaret of Anjou was taken prisoner. And King Henry VI? He was quietly put to death in the Tower of London, likely on Edward's orders. The Lancastrian star had fallen. Edward IV reclaimed his throne. The House of York stood supreme. For now. The Wars of the Roses, Part 9, The Princes in the Tower, Betrayal in the Shadows of Power. The year was 1483. After over a decade of peace under Edward IV, England seemed finally steady. But behind the gold-trimmed curtains of Westminster, shadows stirred. Edward IV, strong, victorious, and beloved, died unexpectedly at the age of 40. The crown passed to his eldest son, Edward Fuffs, just 12 years old. Too young to rule, he was placed under the care of his uncle, Richard, Duke of Gloucester. To many, Richard was loyal, pious, and brave, a man who had fought beside his brother and served the Yorkist cause. But to others, he was waiting, watching, calculating. Young Edward Fuff was lodged in the Tower of London, officially to await his coronation. Then a chilling turn. Within weeks, a declaration spread across the land. Edward IV's marriage to Elizabeth Woodville had been illegitimate. Their children, bastards. The throne, it was said, rightfully belonged to Richard. And so, in the summer of 1483, Richard was crowned king, taking the name Richard III. As for Edward V and his younger brother, Richard, Duke of York, they were never seen again. Whispers spread across England. The princes, they are dead. Murdered in the Tower. No proof. No trial. Just silence. Some said they were suffocated in their sleep. Others believed they were poisoned or taken away in secrecy. But the world would remember them as the princes in the Tower, symbols of innocence lost and power abused. Richard III ruled under a cloud of distrust and fear. Though he implemented just reforms and governed with order, the blood on his crown never dried. His supporters grew uneasy, and across the sea, in Brittany, a new claimant stirred. Henry Tudor, a descendant of the Lancastrians through his mother Margaret Beaufort, watched and waited. He knew England was tired of betrayal, of murder, of war cloaked in law. And the people were ready, not for another civil war, but for an end. The Wars of the Roses. Part text, Bosworth Field and the Rise of the Tudors. A crown lost, a dynasty born. The year was 1485. England stood on the brink, fractured by decades of bloodshed. The houses of Lancaster and York had torn the nation apart, leaving behind ruined fields, grieving families, and a people desperate for peace. And now, two men prepared to end it all in a single battle. King of England sat uneasy on his throne. Though he ruled by law, the ghost of the princes in the tower haunted him, and trust was slipping through his fingers like sand. Nobles defected. Whispers of rebellion echoed in the halls of castles. Across the English Channel, Henry Tudor, exiled in Brittany, gathered strength. With Lancastrian blood and a fragile claim, he rallied support from English exiles, Welsh nobles, and the French crown. He was not just a man now. He was a cause. And so began the march. Henry landed in Wales in August 1485. His banner, a red dragon on a field of green and white. He advanced through the countryside, quietly, steadily, gaining supporters as he moved east. Richard prepared to meet him near Leicestershire, at a quiet hill called Bosworth Field. The Battle of Bosworth, August 22, 1485. It was a clear morning. Richard's army stood strong, larger, well-positioned. Henry's forces were smaller, a patchwork of loyalists, French mercenaries, and hope. But it was not just swords and arrows that would decide the battle. It was loyalty, and loyalty was fading. During the clash, Lord Stanley, whose allegiance had remained uncertain, turned on Richard at the crucial moment, charging into battle on Henry's side. Richard, realizing the tide was turning, did the unthinkable. He led a direct cavalry charge toward Henry himself, aiming to end the war with a single strike. But he never reached him. Richard III was unhorsed and surrounded. Refusing to flee, he fought on foot, sword in hand, crying out, "Treason! Treason!" He died in the thick of combat, the last English king to die in battle. His crown was found in the mud, and on that same field, Henry Tudor was crowned with it, surrounded by his men. The rise of the Tudors. Henry VII now reigned, not just as victor, but as the man who would end a generation of civil war. To unite the feuding houses, he married Elizabeth of York, daughter of Edward IV. Their union birthed the Tudor dynasty, a new era of stability, renewal, and royal might. And though the Wars of the Roses had ended in blood, they gave rise to one of England's most iconic royal lines. The Wars of the Roses began with ambition and ended with unity. From Richard of York to Margaret of Anjou, from Henry VI to Richard III, all were pieces in a tragic, tangled chess game. And in the end, the game chose a new player, a quiet exile who became a king. Thank you for listening to The Wars of the Roses. If you enjoyed this epic tale of betrayal, legacy, and rebirth, please subscribe for more deep storytelling from medieval Europe. In an age of kings and castles where power often ruled over principle, there lived a man who stood not just with a sword, but with unwavering loyalty and honor. His name was William Marshal, the man who served 5 English kings, who stood between the crown and collapse, and who came to be known as the greatest knight of the Middle Ages. Today, we begin a 10-part journey to rediscover his story, from humble beginnings to legendary legacy. This is a tale of courage, duty, and the quiet strength of a heart that never wavered. Calm, profound, moving. Welcome to the story of William Marshal, the most loyal man in England. Part: The Stormy Beginnings of William Marshal. In the cold winds of 12th century England, when kings wore crowns of steel and the fate of nobles hung by a thread, a baby was born not in glory, but in the shadow of war. William Marshal was born around Winwop 46, the 4th son of John Marshal, a ruthless knight who served under King Stephen during the bloody period of civil war known as the Anarchy. At that time, England was split between those loyal to King Stephen and the supporters of Empress Matilda, daughter of Henry I. Castles burned, families divided, and little William, barely old enough to walk, was already a pawn on the board of royal conflict. In 1152, when William was about 6 years old, his father John Marshal committed one of the most chilling acts of defiance in English feudal history. Besieged by King Stephen and under pressure to surrender, John was forced to give William as a hostage, an assurance that he would keep his word. But John broke that word. When King Stephen threatened to hang the boy, John Marshal replied coldly, "I still have the hammer and the anvil with which to forge even finer sons." Stephen was so stunned by the answer that he didn't harm William. The boy was spared by nothing but sheer defiance. From that moment, William's life became legend. He grew up in the dangerous court of Plantagenet kings, surrounded by betrayal, ambition, and the ever-present clang of armor. But instead of becoming bitter or broken, he grew into a man of honor. He served 5 kings, fought in more than 100 tournaments, and won every heart not by deception, but by unwavering loyalty. In this chapter of our saga, we follow William from the moment he was given up as a hostage to his first steps into knighthood. A boy forged in fire, destined not to fall, but to rise. Stay with us as we uncover the legacy of the most loyal knight England ever knew. William Marshal, the guardian of crowns, the sword that never betrayed. Part 2, The Apprentice Knight, Training, Trials, and First Glory. After surviving his childhood as a hostage, William Marshal was sent away, not to a palace, but to a knight's household. Like many young nobles without land or title, his path to power began with service. Around the age of 13 or 14, William became a page, then a squire, in the household of William de Tancarville, a Norman baron in northern France. There, his days were filled with labor and learning. He groomed horses, polished weapons, helped in the armory, and listened. Always listened. He trained with sword and spear, learned horsemanship, and endured the discipline of life in a feudal court. But William was not born rich. He had no inheritance. If he was to rise, it would be by his skill and the honor of his blade. By his early 20s, he was knighted. And then came the tournaments. Not mere sport. Tournaments in the 12th century were brutal, full-contact battles between knights where combatants fought in teams or one-on-one using blunted weapons to capture opponents for ransom. William excelled. He was bold, fast, and above all, honorable. He never struck a man already down. He never betrayed a companion. But he was ruthless in pursuit of victory. His fame began to grow. In one tournament, it was said he defeated 10 knights before noon, and then more after the feast. He didn't just fight, he strategized. He understood terrain, timing, and psychology, and he began to make a name that would echo across France and England. But beyond the armor, William Marshal remained a man of humility. When praised, he bowed his head. When rewarded, he shared his coin with his fellow knights and squires. He believed no victory was his alone. Through these years, William learned not only to fight, but to lead. He studied loyalty, patience, and honor. He built friendships with lords and princes. And most importantly, he remained true to his word in a world where promises were cheap. By the time he returned to England, William Marshal was no longer a nameless second son. He was a knight of rising legend, a blade of the realm, a symbol of feudal chivalry, and a man whose story was just beginning. Part 3, First Battles for Honor. By the mid-1660s, William Marshal was no longer just a tournament champion. He was being noticed by the nobility. But true recognition would come not on the tournament field, but on the battlefield of real politics. He entered the service of Eleanor of Aquitaine, the powerful Queen Mother of England, wife of Henry II, and mother of young princes vying for power. From her, William was entrusted with a grave duty, to mentor and protect her son, Henry the young king. Henry was crowned during his father's reign, a king without power, groomed for future rule. He had wealth, a court of his own, and the restless pride of youth. William became his guardian knight, a mentor, companion, and silent pillar of strength. Their bond grew. In William, young Henry saw the ideal knight, loyal, brave, and humble. Together they traveled across Europe, attending courts, joining tournaments, and defending honor. In one battle near the border of Aquitaine, William fought against rebels seeking to exploit the young prince's inexperience. He led charges, he broke lances, he protected Henry with his own body. More than once, William was struck down, but he never stayed down for long. He began gaining enemies too, jealous courtiers who whispered that Marshal had grown too close to the prince, had too much influence, perhaps even ambitions of his own. But William never sought favor through deceit. He let his sword and silence speak. Then came a tragic turn. In 1183, Prince Henry the young king fell ill with dysentery. As he lay dying, William stood at his side. The prince, in a final act of devotion, gave William his own cloak and asked him to fulfill one last request, to journey to the Holy Land and place his cloak upon the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem. William obeyed. Across mountains and seas, he traveled to fulfill his oath. He fought with the Crusaders. He walked barefoot to the sacred church and laid the prince's cloak in reverence. He did not stay long. He had no hunger for holy war or conquest. His vow was fulfilled, and he returned to Europe changed, not in strength, but in soul. By now, he had earned a reputation not only as a warrior, but as a man of honor. He had no lands, no title, no court, yet kings spoke his name. William Marshal, loyal to the end and loyal beyond death. His journey was far from over, but the world had begun to see what kind of knight he truly was, not forged by ambition, but by faith, loyalty, and love. Part 4, A New King and the Days of Trial. After returning from the Holy Land, William Marshal arrived in a kingdom still reeling from loss. Prince Henry was dead, and his father, King Henry II, was aging and under siege by his remaining sons. The year was 1184. The Plantagenet family was tearing itself apart. Richard the Lionheart, fiery and ambitious, demanded recognition as heir. Meanwhile, Prince John, the youngest, was sowing mistrust and craving power. Eleanor of Aquitaine, imprisoned for her past rebellions, watched in silence from her castle prison. And William? He had no place. His former lord was dead. He had fulfilled his final vow. There were whispers of landless knights with fading names. But fate was not finished with William Marshal. To everyone's surprise, King Henry II summoned William back to court, granting him lands in Normandy and restoring his honor. He knew William's loyalty was unwavering, and he needed such men in these dark days. William took no side, not out of fear, but out of principle. He served the king until the bitter end, through the final battles against Richard and the betrayals of John. When Henry II died in 1189, heartbroken and defeated by his own sons, William was one of the few who remained beside him. He helped carry the old king's body to its resting place at Fontevraud Abbey. And then came Richard the Lionheart, now crowned King of England. Everyone expected William Marshal to be cast aside. After all, he had stood against Richard in defense of the old king. But Richard, though proud and quick-tempered, was no fool. He saw in William not an enemy, but a man who stood for loyalty above politics. Richard not only forgave William, he elevated him. He restored more lands, he gave him command of castles, and most important of all, he entrusted William with the care of his youngest brother, Prince John. It was a dangerous appointment. John was impulsive, cunning, and never trusted fully by his family, but William accepted the duty. He now found himself in the heart of the Plantagenet storm again, torn between ambition, loyalty, and the uncertain future of a kingdom held together by war and blood. His days of courtly tournaments were over. Now came the days of politics, patience, and survival. And through it all, William remained what he had always been, a knight who served not for gain, but for honor. Part V, The Fateful Marriage. By the year 1189, William Marshal had risen from a landless knight to a respected noble under the reign of King Richard the Lionheart. But he was still missing one thing, a family of his own, and a legacy to carry forward, and fate, once again, had not forgotten him. At the age of 43, an age many considered late for marriage, William was offered something unexpected. The hand of Isabel de Clare, the daughter and sole heiress of Richard de Clare, the powerful Earl of Pembroke. She was just 17, beautiful, intelligent, and the heiress to vast lands in England, Wales, and Ireland. Many questioned the match. Why give such a wealthy and noble bride to a knight, no matter how loyal? But King Richard saw clearly. He needed a trustworthy man to manage the volatile Irish territories and defend the crown's interests. William was not just trustworthy, he was unshakable. And so in 1189, William Marshal married Isabel de Clare, becoming Earl of Pembroke and one of the most powerful men in the realm overnight. But the marriage was not one of cold convenience. Despite the difference in age and background, William and Isabel formed a deep and affectionate bond. Their letters, recorded in chronicles, spoke of mutual respect, warmth, and devotion. They would go on to have 10 children, and Isabel would prove to be not just a noble lady, but a capable steward of their estates, especially when William was away. With this marriage, William Marshal's life entered a new phase. He was now not just a knight, but a husband, a father, and a statesman. He began managing lands in Ireland, building castles, securing borders, and forging new political alliances. But trouble was never far away. Prince John, still watching from the shadows, was growing bolder. Richard was focused on crusades, leaving the kingdom vulnerable, and soon William would have to decide between royal loyalty and the safety of his own growing family. But for now, in the halls of Pembroke, with his young wife and the promise of a dynasty, William Marshal had everything he had once thought impossible. From a landless squire to the husband of an heiress, from a forgotten son to the founder of a noble house. And yet, he remained the same at heart, a man of honor, forged in hardship and guided by loyalty. Part 6, The Days Under King John. The year was 1199. King Richard the Lionheart was dead, struck by a crossbow bolt during a minor siege in France. The throne now passed to his brother, Prince John, a man ambitious, suspicious, and dangerously unpredictable. For William Marshal, it was a turning point. Despite their complicated past, William swore loyalty to King John, as he had always done for the crown. But unlike Richard, John lacked charisma and quickly made enemies both at home and abroad. He was jealous of William's popularity and wary of his influence. Even though William remained loyal, his honesty and moral stance often clashed with the king's scheming ways. Yet William, as always, walked the line carefully. He advised the king, protected royal lands, and traveled often between Ireland and England, managing not only his own estates, but also negotiating peace with rebellious barons. Meanwhile, his children were growing, and his wife Isabel was proving to be a wise and patient partner. But tension brewed across the land. King John's rule became harsher. He raised taxes, dismissed loyal nobles, and lost key territories in France. By 1215, a full rebellion had broken out among the English barons. The crisis came to a head with a document that would shape the future of England, Magna Carta. William Marshal, now in his 60s, was one of the few men trusted by both sides. He tried to mediate, but King John, impulsive as ever, agreed to the charter only to reject it days later. Civil war followed. William refused to take sides against the king. Loyalty was his compass. But fate turned quickly. In 1216, King John died, leaving the kingdom in chaos. His son, Henry III, was only 9 years old. And now, as England teetered on the brink of destruction, all eyes turned once again to William Marshal, the man who had served 4 kings. He was named regent, the protector of the boy king and temporary ruler of the land. At the age of 70, William Marshal, the knight who had once been penniless, was now the man holding England together. But he knew the path ahead would not be easy. Enemies remained. Foreign invaders threatened the shores, and the loyalty of the realm hung by a thread. Still, with sword in hand and wisdom in his heart, William rode once more, not for glory, but for duty. Part 6, the final battle for England. The year was Muitamorizebi. England was fractured. On one side, Prince Louis of France, who had invaded the country with support from rebellious English barons claiming the crown. On the other, young King Henry III, only a child, helpless, voiceless, and surrounded by enemies. At the center stood William Marshal, now over 70 years old, serving as Regent of England, the last great hope to preserve the kingdom's future. Despite his age, William had lost none of his fire. He called upon loyal lords, raised armies from the western shires, and rallied England behind the boy king. But time was running short. Prince Louis had taken London and fortified castles across the south. The people were unsure. The nobles divided. William didn't wait for fate. He rode into action. In May 1217, at the Battle of Lincoln, the aging knight put on his armor for the last time. His joints ached, his breath was short, but his heart burned with the duty of 1,000 oaths. Against overwhelming odds, he led the charge. Eyewitnesses say that William, though in his 70s, fought like a man half his age, riding straight into the enemy's core. He broke through French lines, scattered the barons, and reclaimed the city. It was a decisive victory, one that changed the course of history. But it came at a cost. His body, worn and wounded, began to falter. By autumn of that year, Prince Louis was defeated and forced to return to France. England was saved, and young Henry III took his rightful place on the throne. But William knew his time was drawing to a close. He began preparing his soul for departure. He returned lands, paid debts, forgave enemies, and called upon the Templars, whom he had long admired, to oversee his burial. He told the boy king, "Never forget the people. They are your strength." And to his sons, "Serve with truth, fight with honor, and lead with mercy." In 1219, William Marshal died peacefully, surrounded by family, monks, and warriors who had followed him through every chapter of his life. He was buried in the Temple Church of London, clad in the white mantle of a Templar knight. And on his tomb, the inscription reads, "The greatest knight who ever lived." The living legacy of William Marshal. Even after his passing in 1219, William Marshal's name refused to fade into the dusty pages of history. He had not only defended a throne, he had defended a nation, and more importantly, an ideal. As regent, he had kept England from collapsing into foreign hands. As a knight, he had embodied the highest virtues of chivalry, loyalty, honor, humility, and courage. And as a man, he had been both fierce in battle and gentle in character. His death did not mark an end, but rather the beginning of a legend. Templar knights mourned him as a brother. Monks remembered his generosity. Commoners spoke his name with warmth. Even King Henry III, once a child saved by William, would grow to rule with many of the values his regent had taught him. The image of William Marshal kneeling with sword in prayer, aged and wise, was passed down in manuscripts, oral stories, and eventually carved in stone. Generations of English knights looked to his example. Some said he was the true measure of a man, not by wealth or title, but by the strength of his soul. His descendants carried the Marshal name into noble houses across Europe, but none would ever surpass the weight of his legacy. In a time of shifting loyalties, William had stood like a pillar, unmoved by gold, flattery, or fear. He refused to betray a king, even when others fled. He never broke an oath, even when it cost him dearly. And though he wielded a sword for most of his life, his greatest strength was always his word. Today, his tomb still rests in Temple Church, London, a quiet place of shadow and light. Visitors come and lay flowers, not just for a night, but for the soul of a time long past, a time when chivalry was not just an idea, but a way of life. And when they ask, who was William Marshal? History answers, he was England's greatest knight, because he was its most faithful servant. Part Acts, the final years, and the knight's farewell. As age crept upon William Marshal, the once mighty warrior began to feel the toll of decades spent in armor and battle. His hands, once so firm with sword and reins, now trembled. His stride slowed, but his mind, clear and sharp, remained a fortress of memory, duty, and wisdom. By the time he turned 70, William knew his journey was near its end. But even as the curtain fell, he did not seek rest. Instead, he summoned his family, his closest companions, and the king himself, Henry III, now grown, to his side. "I have served 5 kings," he said. "I do not regret a day of it, but my time is short. It is time I prepare for my final oath." True to his promise long ago, William had always vowed to die as a Templar knight. And so, in the quiet chapel of his estate, he was officially received into the Order of the Knights Templar. They clothed him in the simple white robes with the red cross, stripping away all the titles, all the power. He was no longer an earl, a regent, or a legend. He was once again simply a knight, kneeling in prayer. "Do not mourn me as a prince," he whispered. "Mourn me as a man who tried his best." In those final days, he spoke with his sons, urging them to serve with honor, not ambition. He recalled the many roads he had walked, from tournaments in France to the halls of kings to the bloody fields of civil war, and said, "Strength is nothing if it is not guided by virtue." On May 14, 1219, William Marshal breathed his last breath. It was not on a battlefield, but in peace, surrounded by those who loved him. No shouts, no glory, just the rustle of wind through the window and the silence of a world losing one of its finest sons. He was buried at Temple Church in London, as he had wished, among the knights, beneath the vaults where light falls gently across stone. And on his tomb, these words were spoken: "Here lies William Marshal, true knight, loyal guardian, and servant of the realm. May the angels carry him where swords no longer shine and honor never fades." Part X, The Echo of History. Centuries have passed since William Marshal walked the stone halls of castles and rode beneath banners snapping in the wind, yet his name still lingers, not merely in books or on tombstones, but in the very idea of what it means to be a knight. He was not the richest, he was not the most powerful, but he was, by many accounts, the greatest knight who ever lived. Kings trusted him, enemies respected him, and the people remembered him, not just for the wars he won, but for the integrity he never surrendered. In an age when loyalty could be bought and honor was easily broken, William stood firm like an oak in a storm. He served, he protected, he loved, not perfectly, but faithfully. From the dusty tournaments of Normandy to the coronation of boy kings to the defense of a fragile England, his life was a bridge across chaos, a living code of chivalry. And when the world around him trembled, it was William Marshal who stood between the realm and ruin. Today, you can still visit his grave at Temple Church in London. You can walk the path he once did, feel the echo of hooves on cobblestones, and see in history's mirror the silhouette of a man who lived not for glory, but for duty. Be faithful in small things, his spirit seems to whisper. And in the end, even the smallest man may become a legend. That is the legacy of William Marshal, a shield for the innocent, a sword for the king, a heart that never betrayed what it believed in, a knight, a father, a guardian of the realm, and for all time to come when people ask, what does it mean to be a true knight? Let the story of William Marshal be the answer. The journey ends, but the legend lives on. William Marshal was not just a warrior. He was a symbol of an age, of unconditional loyalty, and of nobility in the midst of chaos. In a world of power plays and betrayal, he chose to serve instead of rule, stand true instead of break, and live by his faith until his final breath. If this story moved you, share it, so his name will echo not just in books, but in hearts that still believe in honor. Thank you for listening. Through the journey of two destinies, we've witnessed two contrasting paths of history. One man, William Marshal, lived a life of honor, becoming the symbol of loyalty and justice. Though the tides of power shifted, he remained steadfast, a moral fortress amidst political storms. Another era, the Wars of the Roses, was a tragic epic drenched in blood and ambition. Power changed hands through battles and betrayals, and from the ashes, a new dynasty rose. Two tales, one about unchanging ideals, the other about the cost of ambition. Thank you for joining us on this journey through time. If you enjoy slow, soulful historical storytelling, don't forget to subscribe for more legends and chronicles. Until we meet again, on quiet nights, by the flickering candlelight, and in the stories history has yet to fully tell.